Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bridging the Antietam Institute keynote presentation. My name is Alicia Drumgold, and I am the Faculty Project Director for Bridging the Antietam. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the rest of our Bridging the Antietam grant team. Professors Catherine Benchoff, Dr. Laura Cunard, and Professor James Niesner. Our team has worked together for the last 4 years to help bring place-based learning events to our classrooms and to our community. We'd also like to thank the people here on campus who've made this project possible, including Dr. James Klauber, our college president, Dr. Laura Renninger, our administrative director, Rebecca McDermott, and the HCC grants team, the Office of Finance, the Office of Human Resources, Digital Printing and Design Services, Learning Technology, our Public Relations and Marketing team, and all of the other people who have made this project possible. Thank you very much to them, too. Tonight's presentation and the Bridging the Antietam grant have been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Democracy demands wisdom. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in the Institute do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. If you'd like to attend any of tomorrow's events, the signs outside contain a QR code that will bring you to our website containing further details and Zoom links to tomorrow's digital sessions. Additionally, please join us tomorrow night at 5 p.m. in the HCC Student Center for a celebration of story with the Antietam Storytellers Guild. Now, please allow me to introduce you to this evening's speaker. Adam Booth is a professional storyteller and 2022 West Virginia Folk Artist of the Year. A focus on craft propels his handling of story. Career highlights include Kennedy Center Millennium Stage, Teller in Residence at the International Storytelling Center 3 times, the National Storytelling Festival, Timpanogo Storytelling Festival, the Appalachian Studies Association Conference, the National Academy of Medicine, and spoken word resident at the Banff Center in Alberta, Canada. He's a member of the Recording Academy, and his recordings have received a Parents' Choice Gold Award, 2 Parents' Choice Silver Honors, and 5 Storytelling World Awards and Honors. He is a 4-time champion of the West Virginia Liars Contest. Please join me in welcoming Adam Booth.
Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you for coming out tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about how tonight's going to work. Keynoting an institute that is devoted to storytelling gives me an interesting opportunity, unique opportunity to both tell stories and to talk about storytelling. And so I'm going to split this evening doing just that. So at times I'll be behind this podium talking about stories and storytelling and maybe some theory and philosophy about storytelling that hopefully will get us in the academic mood for this year's institute. And then to supplement what I'm saying, I'm going to occasionally go over there and tell you stories. And I'll go over there so that this isn't in the way, and because I am somewhat of a physical storyteller, and I have a bit of a difficulty telling a story from behind a podium. I'll knock into it and kick it, and it won't be a good experience. So I'm going to go back and forth between these 2 parts of the stage. And I am so grateful that I have been invited to come tonight to tell stories and to speak about storytelling. Thank you all for inviting me and for devoting this institute to storytelling and strengthening our communities through storytelling. As someone who devotes his life to this topic, I think it's really wonderful that this institute exists. I also want to mention just a personal preference about tonight, and that is that even though I'm going to be telling a lot of stories, our tendency is to applaud at the end of storytelling. Like when someone has done something, you clap just to show your appreciation. And I'm going to ask that if you are so inclined to do that, that you just wait till the end of the program. Because what I'm going to be telling over there relates to what I'm positing over here, and I want the whole evening to have one continual flow to it. I often think about a story that I heard from a mentor, an elder storyteller, also from Appalachia, who told me about a First Nations storyteller from Canada who came down to the American National Storytelling Festival. And at the end of every one of his stories, the audience would start clapping and clapping. And the community that he comes from, one of the worst possible things you could do is to clap your hands at another person. And it was very difficult for him to engage in community building just because of that disconnect right there. Now, I don't have that disconnect. I love it when people clap for me. But I'm always mindful of cultural differences like that now that I've heard that. And so really what I want to do tonight is build one long program of talking about story and storytelling seamlessly. So everything that I talk about tonight was going to point towards two central beliefs. One of them is storytelling is really simply conversation. And the other point is that the act of forming and preserving community is inherent in storytelling. People who experience storytelling exist in community. And those who don't experience storytelling, well, they tend to be hermits or reclusive people, or more seriously, in very vulnerable isolation, which then can disrupt the fabric of our communities based upon the actions that they might take because of that isolation. That is the basis of storytelling and the basis of what I want to talk about tonight. I think it's really easy to observe how storytelling forms community. And we can observe it without getting too broadly sociological. We don't have to get very academic about it to understand how storytelling forms community. All you have to do is think about awkward situations. Think about stepping into a middle school cafeteria. Maybe when you were a middle school student, or if you spent time volunteering in a school, or maybe you work in a middle school. All you have to do is look around and observe how students will tell stories to each other and suddenly form communities in that space. Or you can observe how students tell stories about other people and see how community is formed. Just yesterday, I was in a middle school telling stories, and during one of the assemblies in a library, I noticed a group of students came in and sat in the very back, and there was a young man in the center who was looking around, and all these people were talking around him, and he had no one to talk to. And as more students filed in, he noticed in the very front row, there was an empty seat, and there were a bunch of boys that were looking at a video game. And he kind of did this until he couldn't take it any longer. And then he popped up to that front row and jumped right in. And there was that community. And it happened because they were talking over their shared experience through storytelling with what that game was and how they related to it. I know there are a number of students here and who will be observing this, and I want you to think about your first few days of a new semester when you're hoping to find someone you know in a class so that you can bond with them. And how great does it feel when you recognize someone from another class? Oh, aren't we in the same chemistry class? Isn't it terrible? Doesn't that teacher give so much homework? I know, I was up so late last night. The stories start and you have that community. This also happens in politics. It happens in peacemaking. These are places where often the act of a shared story is the thing that massages people's perspectives toward an intended community goal. So we're going to experience that right now, okay? I'm going to invite you to turn to a neighbor, and I hope you will not turn to the person you came here with. Now, you're adults, and so this is going to be the honor system. But I'm going to ask you to do this. Turn to someone, if you can, that you didn't come with. And I want you to talk to that person about one of two things. Either your favorite relative, or if you don't like your family, it can be it can be a favorite teacher that you've had, or The other option is talk about something that you've inherited. And you get 2 minutes. And I'm going to treat you very similarly to elementary school children, which honestly I think is a compliment. I grew up in Mr. Rogers, and there can be nothing greater than, getting to the level of a child. In 2 minutes, when 2 minutes has passed, I'm going to ring this fancy set of bells right here. And that's our timekeeper. And when you hear the bells, then you know it's time for the other person in your group to tell the story. So one person is telling a story, one is experiencing. When you hear the bells, you're going to switch. And if you're the kind of person that thinks this is the most dreadful exercise on the face of the earth, you can join a pair and just observe everything that happens. Okay? Ready? Set. Tell some stories. Change. I know, 2 minutes goes quickly, doesn't it? Switch. That sound means it's time to go back. Find your seats. End your conversations. I'll put the bells away. You have just made community through story, right? And I intentionally gave you two topics that were focused. If I said just talk about a family member, what would have happened? But you had a common experience here. Talk about someone that you liked in your family, right? Someone who had an influence in you, or something you inherited, which is a little broader because it could have been tangible, it could have been a trait, it could have been a personality element. And it was wonderful to watch these little communities pop up, and they were all little micro-communities within a larger community. Some of you are showing pictures to each other. Some of you are this type of talker. Some of you are this type. Okay. We each have our own way, but we were getting to know each other in these little pockets all throughout through story. And I wonder often what role storytelling plays in preserving and maintaining community. You've built community. We've just done a little example of what happens all the time in our communities. But how is that preserved and maintained? This is something I think a lot about because it's my profession. I've devoted my life to this concept. I believe that our shared stories foster a sense of belonging, and they help us understand what we collectively believe, and they help us identify a sense of us. People from Pittsburgh, and people from Kenya, and people who are in medical school, and people who skateboard, and people who no longer listen to Ye's music. These are all communities that have a sense of us based upon the stories that they tell and their collective experiences. Now, I'm from Appalachia. I grew up, I'm at least a seventh generation Appalachian, and Appalachia is no different. And like I said, I've devoted my adult life to the idea of trying to seek out how these communities are built and perpetuated. So I'm going to tell you a seasonal story, okay? It is a traditional story. It lies in traditional belief. It might not be your traditional belief, and I'm hoping that I've brought in my first story example as one that is not your traditional belief, just so that you might experience something that is out of your comfort zone, and let you know a little of something that comes from Appalachia. And when I say a seasonal story, I'm not one of those people that likes it when Christmas music starts playing on November 1st. So I don't mean that season, okay? In my profession, I'm still in last month's season, okay? So let me tell you a story. And it's a story that comes from the southernmost part of West Virginia. West Virginia has 55 counties, and the very southernmost county is called Mercer County. Mercer County is a very rural place, and this story comes from there. It was known a long time ago that there was a house out in rural Mercer County that couldn't keep a family in it. A family would move in, and just about as soon as they get done unpacking the first of their boxes, strange things would have been happening. That's what I mean by seasonal. So strange that they would start to pack back up and leave the next day. Another family would move in, and the same thing would happen. Voices, sounds, things would move out of their control, and they'd pack up and move away. And as this happened over and over again, the house got the reputation for being haunted. Now, I'm going to take a little step out of the story to explain that term that I just said. Where I come from, we have a belief that there are two types of ghosts. I'm not necessarily saying I do, but Appalachian people, some do, believe that there are two types of ghosts. There are haunts and there are haunts. A haunt would be the spirit of a person who has died, but for some reason, that spirit can't fully make the transition over to whatever comes next. Maybe they had a wrongful death, a tractor accident, a murder. Maybe at the time of death, they were in love with someone, and that love wasn't reciprocated. Or maybe at the time of their death, they really wanted something to be buried with them, and it was their dying wish, and the family said, "No way, we're holding on to that object." Or maybe their spirit knew that someone in the family or community was going to need help, and so the spirit stuck around to help them. What happens in that case is the spirit haunts a place until whatever was left undone at the time of death is completed, and then the spirit can fully transition on over, and that ghost is gone. Because haunts were at one point humans, they have empathy. And maybe you are like this, but a lot of humans are really afraid of the thought of ghosts. If they happen to encounter a ghost or a spirit, it's the most terrifying thing. But haunts aren't scary. They just have some unfinished business. And if you help them, then often they'll reward you. Haints, on the other hand, as one of my mentors from Appalachia taught me, you know a haint because a haint ain't never been alive. They were never a human at one point. This is just a freestanding spirit. These are the spirits, the ghosts that are malicious. These are the ghosts that do not want you where they are. I was explaining this the other day to some students. Someone said, "What's Casper?" I said, "Casper is a haunt." The friendly ghost, right? The haints are on the other side. And so lots and lots of folk belief has developed over how to protect yourself from haints. Some folks have traditions of sprinkling salt around places where they want to be safe. Maybe the doorstep, the threshold. They'll do a sweeping ceremony with salt to make sure that their new home will be protected from haints. Others, especially deep in the southern part of Appalachia and further into the south, will say when you go to bed at night, put your shoes pointing in opposite directions at the end of your bed. That way, if a haint comes for you in the middle of the night, they see those shoes pointing in different directions. They get confused on whether they were coming or going, and they can't make it to you, and you'll be okay. Others say that blue glass is really attractive to evil spirits. And so if you keep blue glass around your property, it'll attract them to that. And in fact, some folks, especially in like real rural parts of the country, they'll take a tree and put blue glass bottles all over it. Maybe you've seen a glass bottle tree. And the evil spirits come and they see it and they get so attracted to it, they go up into the bottles and they can't get back out. They're stuck up in there and it protects your home. So speaking of homes, there was this haunted house down in Mercer County. And there was a family that had very little money. And the only house that they could afford to buy was this one that was being sold cheap for undisclosed reasons. The family started to move in, and no sooner than the second day in that house, Mother was there in the kitchen, and she was working on some stuff, fixing some things. She set a cast iron skillet back here on the table, and when she turned around, behind her she could hear. When she looked, that skillet had slid all the way across the table. When she set it back and turned back to cut over here, the same thing happened. She might be in one of the rooms of the house and hear this sound upstairs as if someone was walking around on the floorboards. But when she went upstairs to look, nobody was there. At other times, she'd be in some part of the house and hear a sound like a whole bucket of walnuts just got dumped over and would roll, spilling across the floor, some of them rolling down the stairs, but when she went to check on it, there was nothing there. Strange sounds would happen. The feel of wind blowing inside of the house. Well, the family had him a son, and that son was not good. He was a pretty bad kid, and because of his actions around the town, he got sent away to a military academy. He was gone for some time, and there came a break where he got to come home. All of the students at the academy got to go home and see their families for this break, and this was back in the day when it wasn't possible for him to just drive all the way home. It was very rural. It was a different time. And so he was dropped off in the town center. And then he started that long walk following the directions that had been sent to him by mail to get to the house where his family had moved since he'd been gone. His name was Robbie. And as Robbie was walking down those directions, down that path, he passed a house where his best friend lived, Greg. And Greg was outside. "Hey, buddy, how you been?" "Oh, it's been so long." And they went and shook hands. "Oh, tell me, what's it been like while you've been away?" "Oh, so many things have happened. So many people have changed. There's been a lot of growing since you've been gone. I got a lot of tales to tell you." "Well, why don't you follow me? Family's moved to a new house. Come on over. You'll have supper with us and stay the night. We'll stay up late all night. I'll tell you stories about what it's like being away at the academy. Tell you about the girls that are there. You can sleep in a bedroll on the floor at the foot of my bed." "Okay, as long as your mama won't mind." "Oh, she'll be happy to see you." And they walked down that path, and when they got there, Mother came out and was so excited to see her son. "Robbie, oh, you seem to have grown a foot since you've been gone." "Oh, and Greg, it's so good to see you. You'll come in for supper and stay the night." I was hoping. And while they were sitting there at supper, Mother interrupted the conversation. "Now, boys, you should know that there's a haint in this house." "Oh, Mother, you don't believe that kind of stuff, do you? Those are old wives' tales." "I seen it, and I heard it. There's a haint in this house." "Mother, I'm a man now. Things like that don't scare me. I'm training to be a soldier. We'll be all right. You'll be okay. I'll protect you." Well, after the meal, when it got dark, the boys made their way upstairs to the bedroom. Greg unrolled that bedroll and crawled into it. There on the floor, he sat up. Robbie was up in the bed, leaning over that footboard, and they told stories about all the things that boys that age would talk about to each other. "Well, it was the middle of the night. Guess we better get some sleep." Yeah. Greg laid down, and Robbie was going to lay down, but he sat back up. "Just in case there's any kind of spirit in this room that doesn't want us here, let us know right now." Nothing. Told you. And so he laid down in bed. Bang, 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 bang. Bang, 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 bang. Seasonal story. Bang, 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 bang. His bed was banging, bang, bang, like someone was shoving it from the bottom up against the wall like that. And Robbie called out, "Greg, stop it. It's not funny." And Greg from the floor said, "It ain't me. I promise." He said, "Yes, it is. Stop it." As the bed continued to hit like that, that headboard was hitting against the wall. And so he just called out in the darkness, "If something's doing that, stop it right now." And it stopped. "Are you sure it wasn't you?" "Swear." And just as their heart rates were starting to slow again, that quilt on Robbie's bed started to lift up into the air. And that bedroll started to be pulled down from both sides of Greg's body. And they each thought it was the other one doing it. "Stop it. It's not me." "Yes, it is." "Stop doing it to me." "It's not me." "Yes, it is." And while they were arguing about it, that cloth just went higher and higher in the air and started to spin around. Faster and faster until it was just cloth spinning around like that, tangled up into a ball like this. And then one, pow, flew against that wall right there. Bam, so hard that it knocked a hole in that wall. And the cloth flew out, and suddenly a gust blew in. A gale was blowing into that room so fast, swirling around, that the boys had to hold on to something to keep from getting blown against the wall. And Greg said, "I'm getting out of here." And he let go, and it blew him against the wall. And he pulled himself over to the door and ran out that door and down the steps and out the house, back towards his parents' home, down that dirt path. And Robbie let go against the wall. He was blown like that, and he crawled out of that room until he could run down the hallway to where his mother was asleep. "Mother, get up, Mother!" And he spilled out everything that had happened, and they could hear that wind blowing in the other room. And did the only sensible thing that a family would have done. They started packing up. And by the time the sun came up in the morning, their wagon was full of all their belongings. Before they left, they did the other thing that conventional wisdom would have told them to do back in that time. If there was a haint in the house that nobody could get rid of, set it on fire. As soon as that match touched the corner of the house, it was engulfed in flames. In a thought, that whole roof was gone. And in another thought, the second floor was gone. And they watched as that first floor slowly burned down to the ground, as a great plume of smoke rose up into the sky. And since it was sparsely populated, whenever neighbors saw smoke rising up over the trees, they came. They came from distances and watched as that haunted house just burned to the ground. At the very end, the walls collapsed in on themselves like the top of a box. When they thought it was about to smolder and go out, suddenly the embers lit up bright. Red that turned to yellow, that turned to white, and they saw in that pile of burnt down remains that white light started to lift up. And it took the form of kind of a human. But it wasn't really a human. This thing had arms that raised up like this and a head, but its body just tapered down and fizzled out to nothing. And they saw that bright white light rise up into the air until it's gone. That haint was gone. And the house was gone. And since this happened generations ago, all the people who were there to watch it happen are long since gone. The only thing that remains is the story. In people's stories, in communities' stories, you can learn a lot about that community. Even if it's stuff you don't believe, even if it's language you don't understand readily, you can learn quite a bit about a community. This is not my community that this story comes from, but it's another part of Appalachia. And I am Appalachian, and I'm always striving to learn what other people different from me believe within my greater community. So, part of that involves thinking about when we gather to tell a story or gather to experience a story, is it possible to listen to that story in such a way that we can analyze it to understand who these people are, what they believe, which takes a little training, because usually we're just experiencing something and enjoying it without taking the time to analyze what it actually means. And so I think that there's actually something more to storytelling in a community than a shared set of stories that identify those groups. And before I get too far down that path, I want to think about the core of storytelling. Storytelling is the action of orature. And this might be a term that you're unfamiliar with. This is a bit of storytelling academic jargon, orature. I'm sure you've heard of literature most of your life. Orature is the kin to literature. Literature is a printed narrative. Someone has an idea, they commit that idea in a particular set of words, write it down or type it or print it, and the admiration of great authors is how they commit ideas to a particular set of groupings of words and tools within language. So that each time you read Persepolis, or The Color Purple, or I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, or any other banned book, you're appreciating how those authors committed language to the page. Although your understanding of or interpretation of it might change when you reread it at a different time in your life, it's always the same use of language every time, and we expect that out of literature. Orature, though, is spoken narrative. It's worth saying it again. Orature is spoken narrative. And orature, therefore, uses a completely different set of mechanics and aesthetic principles than literature. So, let me demonstrate. Let me lubricate the machinery. There was once a group of students who went to their rabbi, their teacher, and they said, "Rabbi, teach us, how do you tell a story?" How do you tell a story? It's so easy to answer, but not as easy to put into practice. A story must be told in such a way that it becomes a help unto itself. He said it again to teach them. A story must be told in such a way that it becomes a help unto itself. I'll give you an example. My grandfather, may the memory of his name be a blessing. When he was just a young man, he was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the great name, the founder of Hasidism. He learned so much from this wise teacher that he carried with him throughout the rest of his life. And when my grandfather was a very old man, a sickness came over his body so that it was difficult even to walk across the room. And soon that sickness consumed him to the point that he could not get up out of a chair. And in that very late stage of his life, some young Hasids, some young students came and asked him, "Rabbi, tell us, what was the Baal Shem Tov like? You studied with him when you were young. How did he teach? How did he pray?" And grandfather began to tell them about this master, this teacher of his. And when he got to the point about how the Baal Shem Tov prayed, he said, the Baal Shem Tov, he would often pray in such a way that he would get carried away to the point that he would stand up and dance around the room as he prayed. He would sing songs as he prayed. Da 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 da. And in the telling of the story, grandfather got so carried away that he stood up out of his chair, and he began to dance around the room, and he began to sing as well. Da 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 da, like this. Da 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 da. And in that moment, he was cured of his lameness. And that, said the rabbi, is how you tell a story. Orature is spoken narrative. Because orature is spoken extemporaneously, it's not recited, it's not printed and learned and then retold. It changes each time it happens, even if the same story is retold. And factors that change the way that a story is told include the place where it happens, the time of day, the time of year, the age of the storyteller, the age of the people experiencing the story, memory, the amount of time given, interruptions. In my profession, phones that ring while you're telling a story, in the school, bells that go off that they didn't tell you about, motorcycles, ambulances, and on and on and on. This all affects the way that a story is told and retold. How many of you have experienced a family member tell a story when you were young, and then when you heard them tell it again when you were older, only to hear it a very different way? Okay? Same story, different factors. You're older, and you're able to hear it in a different way. They can tell you the same story with a different language that they couldn't tell a child. Or they're older, and now they have a wiser approach to what happened. Or less inhibited approach to what happened. Or they're older and they don't remember as much. Because of this, orature is a living, changing art form. Each time a story is shared, it surfaces from memory in a new way. And some stories get passed in communities through generations. there's something that's valued about them that makes people want to keep retelling these stories so that they adapt through generations to place and to time, and sometimes they move from one community to another. Now, at some point, literature became valued enough that narratives and orature began to be committed to literature. And this is great for the preservation of ideas. But the moment that a spoken story gets printed and mass-produced, it has the potential to slow or halt that living development of the story as it's passed through a community. If the printed version becomes popular enough, it ceases to change and often becomes authoritative. So think, for example, of Disney's film Cinderella. This is only one version of a story that has hundreds of imaginative, vernacular versions all around the world. Yet we consider Disney's version to be the story of how it goes. It's become that popular. And in fact, until recently, like maybe if you saw the Camila Cabello version, you might never have seen a non-white Cinderella in a story or heard any story like that, when there are actually many. Disney's text easily shadows the ancient Chinese tale of Ye Xian, one of the oldest of the Cinderella tales, or the African story of Rhodopus, similarly, one of the oldest versions of that story, or the Appalachian version of this tale, Ashpat or Ashipad or Ashenpoodle, or the Micmac First Nations story of the charred-faced girl. I often look at it like this. This is not unlike the difference in taste, color, and shape of a tomato that you buy from a supermarket versus a tomato that you grow in your backyard. One often is grown far away and shipped to you, and they all look identical. And one of them, you played a role in making it get that way, and often it's grown from a seed that was kept in your community for generations, sometimes longer than people can even remember. So storytelling in communities could be thought of as heirloom storytelling, right? I'm going to tell you a variant of Cinderella next. And I want you to think of it as a heritage version of this tale. As the Cinderella tale types have been collected in folklore studies, what we find is that some of them branch off and become their own tales and have parts that are similar to Cinderella, and as Disney put it, or Charles Perrault put it, but some of them don't have that at all. So I'm going to tell this story to you. It's a story that was told to me by a storyteller who heard it from her grandfather, who was a circuit preacher, who heard it from someone, an elder member of a community in rural Kentucky, who, as far as we know, heard it from their relatives, who heard it from their relatives, and on and on and on. So when I tell it to you now, you are about to join into this unbroken chain of this story being passed through the oral tradition for as long as this variant of it knows. There's a little bit of power in this, right? Because you have the choice, once you hear it, to see if it continues. There was once a king, a rich, powerful king who had anything that he wanted, which included 3 daughters. He was going into town this day, and as a show of how much power he had, he decided to get his daughters anything that they wanted. He called them to him one at a time, the eldest first. When she appeared, "What? What do you want?" "Daughter, I'm going into town. When I return, I could bring you anything that you wish for. I'm that powerful. What would you have?" "Anything. I would love to have a new dress." What color would you wish the dress to be?" "Oh, I would love it to be the color of the birds in the sky." "So you shall have." And she went back to her apartment of rooms where she had been before she was called. Then the second. And when she came, Father, what do you want? I'm busy. Daughter, I'm going into town and can bring you anything you wish for. What would you have? I would love to have a dress. The daughters weren't terribly imaginative. I would love to have a dress, Father. Could I have a dress, please? Of course you can have a dress. What color would you want it to be? I would want it to be the color of all the fish in the sea. So it shall be. And then the youngest. And she approached the great hall, and then the king on the one side of the hall, slowly, slowly. Hi, Daddy. Do you need something? He had watched her the whole time. She was the favorite daughter. Because she reminded him so much of his late wife. Her spirit was the same. Her kindness was the same. Today I will journey into the town, and I will bring you anything you wish. What would you want? I don't need anything. But you can have anything because you are my daughter. What would you want? All I want is that you come home safely. Your older sisters have each asked for a dress. What if I brought you a dress too? Would that please you? If it would please you, it'll please me too. So, she went back to her apartment of rooms. And the king rode into town, and he did his business, and before he left the town, he stopped at that building at the edge of the town where there was known a renowned clothier. He went inside and purchased 3 dresses, one the color of the birds in the sky, and one the color of the fish in the sea, and one the color of purity. He had them all wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and he set those 3 packages into the bag on the side of his horse. He climbed back on the horse and was riding back down that path that led to the walled castle. And as he was heading down that path, well, there must have been a low-lying branch, because he reached up to grab a hold of it. Normally, he would have ripped it from the tree and thrown it to the ground as a show of how powerful he was for all of the townspeople who might have been there to see their king. But as he pulled it back, he noticed that there was a briar of roses wrapped around it. White roses. And he thought of his daughters, so he cut that briar off and set it in that saddlebag to take the roses to his daughters as well. And when he arrived back in the great hall, the first daughter was called. Did you bring my dress? He said, it's right here in this package. Come and take it. She ran towards to get the package, but as she got there, he pulled it back and said, but first tell me, how much do you love me? Easy. Father, I love you more than there are birds in the sky. And that pleased the vain king, because who could count how many birds flew up in the sky? He gave her the dress and a rose, and she ran off to try it. The second daughter came. Oh, Father, you're back. I can't wait to have the dress. Give me. It's in this package. But as she came for it, he pulled it back and said, but first tell me, how much do you love me? Easy. I love you more than there are fish in the sea. And he knew that was a great amount, because who could count all the fish in the sea? The package was given with a white rose, and she went to try it on. And then came the youngest daughter. You've come home. I'm so happy you're back. Here's the dress I got for you. Come, take it from my hands. But as she reached for it, he pulled it back. But first tell me, how much do you love me? What? How much do you love me? Tell me, and then I'll give you this gift. Well, I can't answer that. I just love you. How could I tell you that I love you a certain degree? I just love you, Father, and I'm glad you're home. Your sisters each could answer the question. Tell me, how much do you love me? She said, I did. No, tell me how much you really love me. One sister said more than the birds in the sky. One said more than the fish in the sea. How much do you love me? I just love you. No, tell me now. And she stammered and stuttered and finally spit out, I love you like meat loves salt. What? He didn't understand, and he threw that package to the ground, and he stomped on it. He grabbed her by the hand and drug her across that great room and opened up the secret door in the wall and drug her up this narrow, dark, dank staircase that led to the tallest tower in the castle, the one reserved for the worst of the prisoners. And he opened that door and threw her into it, slammed the door, and looked through this little window and said, "You will stay in here until you can tell me how much you love me." As he stomped down those stairs, she said to herself, "I thought I did." And the youngest princess stayed up in that tower for days that turned to weeks. And the only visitor was a servant that would come every other day with a bowl of pale broth. The princess would look out the window that looked across her father's kingdom and pray for something to come and change all this. And one day, there must have been a prince riding through the edge of the forest near the castle, because he slowed his horse and cupped a hand to his ear and said, "I think I hear a princess crying." This is how you know he's a real prince. "I think I hear a princess crying." And he led the horse to the edge of the forest, and he looked around, and there at the top of the nearby tower was the most beautiful face he'd ever seen. And there must have been a thick briar that grew up the side, maybe a grapevine, because soon the prince was off of his horse and climbing up that tower until he was looking right into the face of that young princess. "If I could help you escape from this tower, would you come home and live with me?" She said, "Yes, anything but this cell." And he helped her down, and they got on the horse, and they rode to the edge of the land where that prince had a boat, and they sailed across the sea till they came to his homeland, where, I'm revising the story a little bit, once they got to know each other and realized that they liked each other, and then they got married. She became a princess, and after long, they ascended to the throne, became king and queen, and their own family grew with children. Now, back in the homeland, the older two sisters, they each married princes of nearby kingdoms, became princesses themselves, and ascended to the thrones in those places. And a great war broke out between their husbands, wondering who would inherit the kingdom that they had each come from, that their wives had come from, where they had grown up. This war broke out, and there were tremendous armies that battled for weeks, that turned to months, that turned to years. And in that tremendous fighting, all the castle that they had grown up in, rubble. And their father, now an old man, had no place to live. He wandered the countryside till he came to the castle where his oldest daughter lived, and he pulled on the ring, and when a servant came, "My daughter lives here, take me to her." When the daughter saw her father, she said, "Father, what are you doing here? I have my own life here. Daughter, I have nowhere to live. May I come and stay here?" She said to her servants, "Take this man down to the dungeon and find some place for him to stay." And he was led down there where the prisoners were fettered against the wall, and rats ran around, and it was no place for a high king. And so he left, and after some time found his way to the middle daughter's castle. And when she saw her father, "What are you doing here? Don't you have another place to be? I have my own life here. Daughter, I don't. I need somewhere to stay." She said to her servants, "Take this man out to the pigsty and find some stall for him to sleep in tonight." And when he got out there among the pigs and the mud and the straw, it was no place for a high king. And so he wandered off into the wilderness. And as I mentioned, this war raged on for years and years, and soon word spread across the sea to other kingdoms, even to the kingdom where the youngest daughter lived. And her husband came to her one day and said, "I will sail across the sea, and I will take an army, and I will end that war." She looked at her husband and said, "Take me with you. The battlefield is no place for you." "No, I wish to go back so that I might see my home. I fear that if I don't go with you, I'll never see my home again." He loved his wife and trusted her, so she too sailed that ship across the sea and rode a horse till they came to the ruins of the castle where she had grown. "Leave me here. Come and collect me when you are returning victorious." And she stayed there in the army, and her husband rode off. And as she surveyed all the rubble, she came across an old man who was wandering around those crumbled stones. His clothing was tattered. He had taken a briar of thorns and curled it up and put it on his head like a crown. And something about his mind had left him. She recognized him immediately, and she cared for him for all the days that it took for her husband to return victorious. And when he came back, she said, "This man here is going to come and live with us. He will return home to our castle. He is no stranger." And her husband trusted her. So the old man, the high king, was brought back. He didn't know who this was. He had never met her father. And when they returned to the castle, the daughter gathered all the servants together, all the workers together, and gave them tasks. "Tomorrow we will have a celebration of this guest of honor. We will have a feast and welcome guests from all over the countryside. Dancers practice the most magnificent acrobatic dances. Musicians prepare the fanciest of fanfares. Others unroll the most beautiful tapestries, wave flags, and prepare for the guests." And as they all went off to do their tasks, she made her way down to the kitchen. She went to the chef. "Cook, I want you to prepare a feast for 100 guests. Make the finest breads. Use the rarest of spices. But when you fix the meat, don't put any salt with it." "Well, I don't want to do that. That won't taste right." "Cook, when you prepare the meat, use no salt." "But Your Highness, that won't taste right. The guests won't like it." "Cook, do you wish to keep your head upon your shoulders?" "As you've asked." And the cook went to work. And the next day the trumpets blared and the tapestries were unfurled and the dancers danced as the doors were open and guests came in, and there was a table that seated over 100, and they all gathered. And at the head of the table, in a throne, was the guest of honor, the high king. The chef came out with a platter of silver with a cloche on top to serve the meat. And when the cloche was lifted, the people gasped at that meat. The marbling that ran through it, there's nothing finer that they had ever seen. He picked up his knife and fork and cut one piece, and they all watched as he brought it to the tip of his tongue and flung it across the room. The fork hit the wall and clattered down to the ground. And the cook looked at the queen and looked back at the guest. "Does the meat not please you?" But with that single taste, his mind was restored. And he looked up and he said through teary eyes, No. He said, "When I was a young man, when I was a vain, proud king, I had a daughter who taught me what it meant to truly love me. When others just said things to please me or get things, she spoke truth. And I banished her and she was gone. She disappeared and I haven't seen her for what seems like a lifetime. Oh, if I could only ask her forgiveness." Stepping from behind the throne, "Father, my daughter, you are the queen here." She said, "Yes." And she lifted him up. And he said, "Can you ever forgive me?" And she said, "Of course I can. Because I love you. I love you like meat." And he smiled and said, "Loves salt." Now knowing that it is salt that preserves meat, that allows it to last when other things don't. "Yes," she said, "I love you like meat loves salt." And her father turned to one of her servants and whispered in the ear, and that servant took off dashing across the castle grounds to a horse that was there at the edge of the grounds, and took off galloping to the edge of the land, jumped onto a boat, and rode across the sea onto another horse that happened to be there, and rode all the way to the rubble, the ruins of the castle that was earlier in the story, and looked there on the very edge, just where the king had mentioned, there was a brown paper package tied in string with a rose on top that the servant collected, gathered all the way, making that journey back. And even though it should have taken weeks to make this journey, it's a wonder tale, so it was just a blink of an eye, and whoop, that servant was back. The king took the package and handed it to his daughter, and she opened, and inside saw a dress, the same color of the purity of new fallen snow. And also through the magic of old stories, she put it on and it fit right there. And she wore that dress anytime there was a special occasion, anytime there wasn't a special occasion, anytime that the people saw it, they were reminded of the purity of their queen and the kindness of her heart. And that is how she and all the people in the kingdom, including her father, the high king, lived. As we say at the end of tales like this, happy ever after. Another thing that happens when we lose the variety of stories that we tell is that it disguises the vivid creative language that the communities have created to tell the stories. We tend to be taught to write, I'm going back to literature, in a standardized form of English that doesn't always sound like the way that we talk, which is difficult for a lot of students. Stories are told, though, in regional dialects that we don't usually use to write. Someone who asks a question would never think to write that they ask a question unless they were taught to. And this is often thought of as wrong or incorrect when it is simply part of the continual development of a language. We also speak with accents, that is how we pronounce words, that are nearly impossible to record in literature. I heard an observation once. Someone was saying, what makes a story Appalachian? And the person quoted someone else, and they said, well, European stories begin once upon a time, but Appalachian stories begin, now, y'all ain't never going to believe this one. And it's a funny comparison, but the answer honestly also reflects accent and dialect. Let's explore this. It's common to end phrases with prepositions where I come from, as is the usage of double negatives and adding in front of verbs, and the common use of metaphor in everyday language, and the disagreement between subject and verb, such as all of those demonstrated in one sentence. We was a-shopping up a storm, but didn't find nothing. Now, I don't know if that meant anything to you, but no one would bat an eye about that type of language where I come from. I often work with students throughout Appalachia who have been made to feel ashamed of the way that they talk, but I feel that part of my job as a storyteller is to come into the communities and encourage them to discover that the way that they talk is actually a product of centuries of creativity and survival. And where we sit here in the Kepler, we're so close to so many wonderful accents and dialects. Very close to here, there are so many people who speak Pennsylvania Dutch, even into the county, especially the counties to the west of here in Maryland. We have so many rural, isolated communities around here that have their own accents and dialects. And to our east, really populated counties where hundreds of languages are being spoken and already beginning to lend their idioms and pronunciation to shape the common language, which is English. This is just how languages develop in a global society. So I want to demonstrate this very quickly. One thing that I find as a storyteller is that when I'm giving a presentation about storytelling, where I also tell stories, is that I over-prepare. and I am almost at the end of the time that I said I would go. So I'm cutting this quick. So I just want to give you a little demonstration of how I believe storytelling works, and then I'm going to conclude. Orature works in such a way that, could I have a volunteer come and stand right here? Someone who doesn't mind being in front of other people. I see you looking for permission. Would you like to come? No? Okay. Oh, great. I'm going to need a second person, so. No, it's fine. You're just standing in place for something, and you can go over there. Okay, this is story. No, this is a storyteller, okay? The way that orature, I believe, works is that the storyteller knows the story. I'm going to be the story, okay? And we're making kind of a triangle here. Do you see the triangle? Okay. The storyteller knows the story, okay? Whatever the memory is in the community, when we go out to listen to stories or ask our family members about story, they know the story. They also have, now forget that I'm a story, because I'm going to go over there, okay? They also have a connection to the storyers. And this is a term that we're starting to use in storytelling studies and folklore studies that replaces the term listener. Listener is an exclusive term, because when someone tells a story, as you've seen me do tonight, we're not only listening to that person. If we have other senses that work, we're watching that storyteller. We're watching their body. We're watching their face. We're watching their eyes and fingers, usually pretty intently, more than we realize. We are also, as storyers, starting to internalize what it is that we're watching and hearing so that we are building the story in our own minds. And we are experiencing the gift of energy from the storyteller. And sometimes that's in the form of, just depending on your own persuasion and belief, sometimes it's their spirit, sometimes it's their aura, sometimes it's their energy. There is an energy conveyance that happens over in this direction to the storyers. And if it's done really well, then we start to shake hands, the story and the storyers, so that, can you step over that way a little bit? The storyer then, later, becomes the storyteller, and they give the story to the next storyers, right? And this is how traditional story has been passed always. This is how you tell the funny story over the dinner table about what happened to you at the grocery store, right? And some stories just die. Okay, it happened once. You know, we had a laugh over it. You don't retell it. But sometimes you will never believe what happened. You get into work the next day, and you have to tell all your coworkers. And then maybe a few of them go home and tell that story, and the story has a little bit of a life. And sometimes the story is so significant that we continue to tell it over and over and over again. Now, would you come back and make this triangle with me again? But when story is fully and wholly practiced as an art form, like I approach it, or in a sense of community, we all start shaking hands with each other. We don't have to, but we're just going to, okay? We all start shaking hands with each other so that the storyteller sometimes experiences things from the story that was never there before. New things will show up in the story because of the way that you're also shaking hands here. You're giving energy that way too. The storyers are saying to the storyteller, here's what I understand and here's what I don't. You have been doing that to me all evening long. As I've been telling you these stories, I'm listening to what you are telling each other. I'm listening to the sounds that you make and the way you breathe. I'm watching your faces and your bodies so that I understand what you understand or what you don't understand. And that has shaped the way that I have told the stories to you. So that each time it happens, it's a little bit different to give you what you need, and so that the story can go to you so that it can then keep making this triangle over and over and over again. Thank you. So this means that orature is communal. It requires multiple people for a story to continue. It happens in real time. Literature, unless it's acted out, tends to be a very solitary activity. We're taught in about first or second grade to read silently and to ourselves. And some people love that. Some people love to get a book and be near the fireplace or on the couch under a blanket and hope that nobody bothers them the rest of the day. But if that person would just start telling a story, then this triangle would never happen. Storytelling requires community. And when we gather with more and more storyers, then there's a phenomenon that happens. Communal expression. We laugh more. When I tell stories to 300 people, they will laugh at things that when I tell the stories to 10 people, they would never laugh at. We are more easily moved to tears. And we leave feeling like a greater exchange of energy has taken place. So I want to circle back to where I left off at the beginning. And is there something more to storytelling than a shared set of ideas that identifies these groups? I want to leave you with an idea. I'm going to let some other people in recording tell some little snippets of stories. I think that there is another element in storytelling that helps us with this community building, the community that we're thinking about at this institute all weekend long. 7 years ago, I got to be a research fellow at a little school in Kentucky called Berea College. Berea is home to many wonderful things. It's a really great school with a radical history. But they have the Leonard Roberts story collection there. Leonard Roberts was a folklorist who lived in the 20th century and collected stories from his students. When folklore classes were first starting to show up in colleges, he was one of those pioneers to teach them. And because there weren't a lot of materials and he was so interested in the stories that people were telling, he would have his students tell stories that they had heard in their home communities in rural Kentucky and West Virginia. And whenever there was a really good storyteller or a good story, he would say to them, "Can I come home with you at the Christmas break or the Thanksgiving break?" And he would then travel to these little communities with a recording machine and put it into, say, a schoolhouse or a community gathering place. And the people were so intrigued by the machine, they would show up to tell stories. He was collecting stories. So this sound archive exists at Berea College. Stories that so many people, especially children, he was really interested in how children told stories because their minds were usually more vivid and the storytelling was more wonderful than the elder people who most folklorists would go to hear stories because they would forget parts of stories. So I went there to study for a whole month. I pretty much lived in the basement of a library. How cool, right? And listened to the recordings of Appalachian stories that have been collected from the 1950s to about 1970. And I was going to look for a certain thing that happens in traditional storytelling, which doesn't relate to what we're talking about tonight. But what I discovered as I was listening to recordings over and over and over again is that I started to hear music in the storytelling. The way that these children and adults would tell the stories, I would hear these rhythms that would show up over and over and over again in the speech. Da-ba-da-da-dee, ba-da-da-da-da. That rhythm showed up over and over and over and over again all throughout stories from the storytellers in these communities. Ba-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee, ba-da-da-da-da. That's another one. And what I found was I could take them and overlay snippets of stories on top of each other, and it was almost like they were singing the same music with different parts of a story. And I want to demonstrate with a few sound examples. Uh-oh. Let me refresh this page.
David will Morrison, Schlickett will Clay.
Okay, this is one this boy. In case you can't hear through the accents of these people, I'll help you out a little bit. He says, "Daub it with moss and slick it with clay." This is part of a very common story that happens in Appalachia, and the rhythm here is ba da da da, ba da 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 da, ba da da da, ba da 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 da. Listen, and you'll hear a bunch of different stories, clips of different stories of people speaking the same rhythm. And then at the end, all together.
David will Morrison, Schlickett will Clay.
Took out a bag, a funny-looking bag. Took out a bag, a funny-looking bag.
Hear the
A
rhythm?
woman came out and she was a witch. A woman came out and she was a witch.
Walked on the floor, it sounded like thunder.
Climbed up in peach trees and was eating some peaches. Make me some mush and you won't get a bite.
On the floor, it sounded like thunder.
When you put them all on top of each other, ba-da-da-da, ba-da-da-da-da. This happened over and over and over again. I was able to identify over 24 of these rhythmic idioms that showed up over and over again. Let me play just for you, just quickly, a couple of other examples.
Quick as daylight comes, quick as daylight comes.
Roost, why'd you crow? Roost, why'd you crow? What must I ask John? What must I ask John?
He's saying, quick as daylight come, rooster, why'd you crow? What must I ask John?
I want my big black toe. I want my big black toe.
That one was, I want my big black toe. This is a spooky story where the family digs up a toe in their field and they end up eating it. Does anybody know this story or a variant of this story? Yes, you do. They end up eating it, and then the creature that it came from comes looking for the toe. It's a haunting story. In other parts of Appalachia, it's a tale. It's called Taily-Po. Let me play another example for you.
Well, said he had a thing that was,
Oh, not sorry.
said a big long thing.
There she came down the street, and they couldn't hardly look at her. She was so pretty. She was so pretty that they all had to look at her longer than they would have before. They couldn't hardly look at her. She was so pretty. They couldn't hardly look at her. She was so pretty. They couldn't hardly look at her. She was so pretty. They couldn't hardly look at her. She was so pretty.
Rhythm.
She was so pretty that they all had to look at her longer than they would have before. She was so pretty that they all had to look at her longer than they would have before. She was so pretty that they all had to look at her longer than they would have before. She was so pretty that they all had to look at her longer than they would have before.
Da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da da. Right? These different rhythms showed up over and over and over and over again. And you might not hear it at first, but when it's repeated, you start to hear it, which is the phenomenon I started to experience after weeks of listening to these stories over and over again. I was like, oh my gosh, there's something connecting all of these things. So, in addition to the points that I mentioned earlier, I think storytelling might encapsulate greater ideas of rhythm or encapsulate shared experience and a subconscious understanding within communities. When we story, our minds and our spirits, or our minds and our energies are communicating to strengthen bonds that we feel, that we see, that we hear, and that there is an underlying pulse that moves us so that we don't stray from each other, so that we're strengthened with stronger ties within the community, and I think so that we know who we are. So in this way, I have come to understand storytelling as a community survival practice. So, I have gone a little bit over the length that I thought I would, but I have tried to tie it up by removing some other stories I was going to tell you. What I agreed, though, was that maybe we would have a few questions. If anybody has any questions about, there's a lot of ideas that I've put here tonight, hopefully to generate thought for us through the weekend of this institute and beyond. If anybody has any questions about the stories I told or any of these ideas or that I just played for you, now is the time. And we have some helpers that will help us communicate across the space. Yeah. Yes. So what I noticed in that particular example is that these were cadences that recurred throughout eastern Kentucky and southwestern West Virginia. Since then, I have been able to hear these same rhythms showing up in field recordings of other people from central Appalachia, like eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, and I think it's something that reflects just that greater community. because, I traveled the country to tell stories. And when I'm out, like in Utah, and hear the Utahn storytellers, or like indigenous storytellers in parts of the Southwest, these rhythms don't show up, but other rhythms do. And I think, if I had a huge grant and all the time in the world, I would love to go and study this. Hopefully this is, a little something that manifests in the project that's happening here. I think that different communities would find that there is some sort of rhythmic bond within the way that they talk to each other. Yeah.
Do you think that might be derivative of that area is primarily Scotch-Irish?
It's possible, and the Appalachia, I think, this is another idea that I have. I think that Appalachia might represent the greatest cross-section of world thought at any point in human history outside of a major city. So many people have come through this region that's just right over there. Some have lived, some have moved on, many were indigenous, and we even have continual immigrations of people into that region. They bring with them their food and their folk, all their folk ways, including their stories. And those stories blend together. And so even storytellers who are Afro-Latin will tell, who might not have any Scots or Irish or Scots-Irish background, will use those, what I think of as Appalachian rhythms in their storytelling. Not everybody, but I have heard some storytellers that do that. Jackie Torrance is a great example. I know there are a number of storytellers here. You might recognize that name. Jackie Torrance was one of the great American storytellers. And you hear some of these rhythms in her storytelling. And she grew up with Appalachian family in North Carolina. So I think that it's probably regional. And I would love to have correspondence with someone that has done this type of work with more isolated, like other isolated communities. Appalachia has been historically isolated until very recently, and even still is quite a bit latent. But like other indigenous communities around the world, to see if this type of thing happens. If you listen enough to the stories, do particular rhythms show up within it? I don't know. In the very back. Larry answered the question for me. When the pandemic began, people like myself, whose careers are based in storytelling, there was a choice. You can switch to platforms like Zoom or Teams or whatever it happens to be to continue to tell stories to people, or you can just wait a long time hoping that we make it through to another side where we can gather again. So on one side, it helped me with my career because I was able to reach communities that I had never reached before because we could have stories through the internet. Communities that maybe couldn't buy a plane ticket for me to fly across the country or to another country were able to experience my storytelling through the internet, which was really cool. But there was a whole shift in the way that I was telling stories because I was now confined to this space. I have a big wingspan. You saw that I use my body a lot, and now people were only seeing this much of me. So I had to rethink about how I told stories, and I also almost completely lost all of the social cues. I couldn't hear people responding. I had no idea how people were breathing. I had no idea what people were telling each other about the stories as they were happening, and for that reason, I got really sick of it. After about a year and a quarter of doing it, I was so sick of it. I was so sick of having this ring light shining in my face and doing, an hour of stories looking into a light like this that I stepped away from it. I said, I have to take care of myself because it reached a point, there was a curve. It was really beneficial, and then it was really detrimental to my health. So I had to step away from it. Ask any other storyteller, and they'll give you their own version of that story that might have ended differently. Well, I'm hoping that the ideas that I've posited tonight and the stories that I've told you will start to generate some conversation. I am, again, so grateful to have been invited to talk about story and to share some stories tonight. And now I think we have some refreshments out in the hall, right? Okay, well, why don't we continue building community through story with food? Thank you all.